Hey, welcome back. This is the second installment in our series on education, and today we're tackling a really big question. What is a school actually for? I mean, is it just a place to get good grades, to get ready for a career, or could it be something more, something much, much bigger? We're about to explore a nearly forgotten blueprint for education, one that aimed to build not just smart students, but whole, capable, and purpose-driven human beings. Let's dig in and see what we can learn.
All right, here's our roadmap. First, we're going to question the very purpose of education itself. Then, we'll dive into a tale of two very different systems and see how one was put to a major test. And that brings us to the heart of it all, a revolutionary blueprint for a new kind of school, and the incredible mission that was driving the whole thing.
So, let's start with that big picture, the purpose of education. For just a minute, let's try to set aside our modern focus on test scores and academic achievement. We're going to look at a philosophy that saw education as the primary force for shaping a person's entire character, and through that, shaping all of society.
You can really feel the urgency in this quote, right? It frames education not as some nice to have, but as something absolutely critical, with incredibly high stakes. The idea here is that the way we choose to educate the next generation isn't just some policy debate, it literally determines the future of our world.
And this was the ultimate goal. For the 19th century reformers we're looking at, education was this deeply moral and spiritual project. It wasn't about just cramming facts into a student's head. It was all about developing the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, to restore their full potential and help them become these resilient, thoughtful, and principled people.
So, this philosophy really set the stage for a major clash between two totally different ways of thinking about learning. You had the dominant, traditional university model on one side, and on the other, this radical, reform-minded alternative that challenged everything it stood for.
The university system that most of us are familiar with today has incredibly deep roots. Its DNA can be traced all the way back to medieval Europe. The University of Paris was the model for Oxford and Cambridge, and then those elite English schools became the direct blueprint for the very first colleges in America, like Harvard and Yale. We're talking about a system with centuries of tradition baked right in.
And what did that traditional system actually look like? Well, it was heavily focused on the classics, Latin, Greek, higher math. Every single student followed the exact same rigid, one-size-fits-all curriculum. The real emphasis was on memorization, and often, the end goal was to create this distinct, highly educated class of scholars and clergy who were kind of set apart from everybody else.
And the contrast here is it's night and day. The traditional system focused almost completely on the mind, aiming to produce scholars who'd get a degree and a certain social standing. But the reform model, it was a total departure. The goal was to develop the entire person by mixing practical, hands-on learning with academics. The desired outcome wasn't a piece of paper. It was a well-formed character and real-world skills for life.
Okay, so now let's jump into a moment in history when the effectiveness of that old traditional system really got called into question. Back in the early 19th century, a crisis forced people to ask if their schools were actually preparing students for the world they were living in or for a world that just didn't exist anymore.
So here's the central mystery. The early 1800s saw this huge wave of religious and social reform movements, just filled with incredible passion and energy. But then, within a single generation, a lot of them had just fizzled out. They lost their momentum, lost their mission. The big question is, why? What went wrong?
The answer, at least according to the reformers, was in the schools. They argued that even though these movements had this powerful world-changing mission, their educational system was still that old traditional model. It was a total mismatch. They were trying to create dynamic, practical reformers, but their schools were designed to produce elite scholars. The values were just completely out of sync.
This quote really captures that feeling of a huge missed opportunity. Instead of fostering a dynamic, practical kind of education that could grow and adapt, these movements fell back on rigid rules and doctrines. They got more worried about preserving old ideas than about developing the character and skills of their young people. They lost the spirit of their mission, and because of that, they just stagnated.
But this failure led to something new, and it brings us to the real heart of our story today, the detailed blueprint for a completely different kind of school. And this wasn't just about tweaking the curriculum a little bit, it was about totally reimagining what a school could and should be from the ground up.
So, the big question is, how did they take this grand philosophy and turn it into something real? Something that students experienced every single day?
Let's break down the core pieces that made this model so revolutionary. The whole system was built on 6 core pillars, and we're going to walk through them one by one. They cover everything, from the curriculum's foundation and the role of manual labor, to the importance of health, the learning environment, student discipline, and even the ultimate goal of education itself.
Okay, pillar number 1 was all about creating unity. The big idea was to use one central book, in this case, the Bible, as the great textbook. And its principles weren't just for theology class. They were meant to provide a moral and intellectual framework for all the subjects, making sure every part of a student's education was connected and value-based.
Now this is where things get really radical. Manual labor wasn't just some elective or an afterthought, it was a core, essential part of the curriculum. Students weren't just sitting and studying, they were building, growing, creating. And this wasn't about job training, it was about forging character, discipline, and a deep sense of self-reliance.
And this was not just a theory, they actually did it. At Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, the students and the college president literally picked up tools and built a 2-story building with their own hands. It just goes to show how deeply this learning by doing philosophy was put into practice. It was all hands on deck, for real.
Next up, the body. The third pillar was health, because these reformers believed that physical well-being was completely inseparable from mental and moral growth. A lot of these schools, like the famous Oberlin College, adopted what was called the Graham diet. It was simple, plant-based, focused on whole foods, and it cut out stimulants like tea and coffee. Health wasn't a side issue, it was absolutely central to the mission. And this quote shows you just how fundamental that belief was. Physiology, the study of the human body, wasn't just another science class. It was seen as the very basis, the foundation of all educational effort. The idea was pretty simple. You can't build a strong mind or a strong character in a weak or unhealthy body. So, you've got a framework for the mind and a focus on the body. The fourth pillar was about the learning environment itself. While the traditional model was building these massive, imposing universities in the middle of cities, the reform model did the exact opposite. They argued for schools to be out in the country, integrated with farms and gardens. The environment itself was seen as a teacher. We actually see this principle in the work of Thomas Jefferson, of all people. When he designed the University of Virginia, he didn't create one giant building. He designed it as an academical village, with separate cottages and gardens. He believed this kind of environment would promote health, quiet study, and a more democratic way of life for everyone there. Okay, now this was a truly radical idea for its time. The goal of discipline in this model was not to force blind obedience through a bunch of strict rules and punishments. No, the whole point was to train a student for self-government. It was all about fostering personal responsibility, so students would learn to govern themselves because it was the right thing to do, not because they were afraid of getting in trouble. And again, at Oberlin College, this idea was actually put into practice. There were no hall monitors, no strict surveillance systems. Students were simply trusted. They were held responsible for reporting their own attendance and for making sure they completed their duties. That's an enormous amount of faith in their character and their ability to govern themselves.
And the final pillar basically turned the traditional goal of education completely upside down. This model rejected the rigid one-size-fits-all curriculum and instead brought in electives, letting students choose subjects that actually fit their individual needs. There was a huge de-emphasis on degrees, on honors, on prizes, anything that pitted students against each other. The focus was on one thing: practical preparation for a life of service.
This fact just floors me. It shows you how deeply this philosophy really took root in the culture. In 1838, a full half of the graduating class at Oberlin voluntarily chose not to receive their formal academic degree. They saw their education as preparation for a mission, and the piece of paper itself, it was secondary to that higher purpose. That is a powerful statement about their values.
So what was the end game here? Why go through all the trouble of building this entirely new, radical system of education? Well, it all came down to a single, powerful purpose: creating people who were fully equipped for a mission.
This was it. This was the final objective. All 6 of those pillars we talked about, the foundational text, the manual labor, the focus on health, the connection to nature, the training in self-rule, and the emphasis on purpose, it was all designed to produce an army of self-supporting pioneers. These weren't meant to be sheltered scholars. They were meant to be practical, resilient people who could go out into the world and be effective agents of change.
And the results of this model? They were just staggering. In a single year, one school, Oberlin, sent out 530 teachers. It sent more missionaries to work with newly freed slaves than all other American colleges combined. This model wasn't just some nice theory. It was a powerful engine for producing service-oriented graduates who made a massive, real-world impact.
This quote just beautifully sums up the entire spirit of the movement. Knowledge wasn't valued for its own sake, it was valued for its practical use in serving other people. The ultimate product of this education wasn't a perfect test score. It was a person of character, with unselfish aims who genuinely found joy in service.
So, what are the big takeaways from this lost blueprint? First, that true education is holistic. It integrates mind, body, and character. Second, that learning really sticks when it's tied to practical, hands-on experience. Third, that a school's environment, from its location to its very buildings, is a powerful educational tool. And finally, that the goal of education can be something far greater than personal achievement. It can be about preparing for a life of service.
And that really brings us full circle, back to where we started. This historical model provides a fascinating mirror for our own time, forcing us to ask some pretty tough questions. The blueprint our schools follow today will absolutely determine the kind of society we live in tomorrow. It's a powerful thought to end on. Thanks for digging into this with me.